Welcome to the next episode of Navigating Carbon, your compass to carbon management. As always, I'm your host, Deb Ryan, and in this episode, I sat down with John MacArthur. John comes from a deep history in the oil and gas space. He's worked for a number of global majors as well as national oil companies throughout his career. However, in recent years, he's been working at this intersection of energy and sustainability. He now works with companies and advises them on strategy and the complexities that exist between developing energy and the carbon management space. And he also brings this expertise to the next generation through his teaching at Imperial College in London. John is based in the UK, so he brings an interesting perspective on energy transition financing, the balance between developing the energy we need, but doing it affordably and with lower emissions. We also discuss policy and also the challenges in bringing together some groups that don't always speak the same language. To stay on top of all upcoming episodes, make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. But for now, sit back and enjoy my conversation with John. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of the Navigating Carbon podcast. Today, I am really excited to have John MacArthur with me. John, how are you? Welcome.
Very good. Hello, everyone.
It's so good you and I have been we've both had a very busy summer. We've been trying to coordinate our schedules for a little while to get this on. I've been looking forward to this conversation. Just for folks that don't know who you are and like your background and stuff like that, give us a little bit of a background around you and, you're deep in the sustainability energy transition space. Give people a bit of an intro.
Yeah. Well, we're both interesting, Deb, because we kind of live in different worlds. The bridge between different worlds that are often seen as adversarial, but actually can work in harmony. So what I mean by that, well, I first studied petroleum engineering. I've got operational experience. I've run oil and gas assets around the world for Shell, and throughout my career, I'm a second generation oil and gas person. So I also worked in innovation, venturing. I was chair of executive investments, corporate investments into oil and gas upstream technologies and things like this. And I actually come from a small business background. My father was in a highly innovative electronics space, working oil and gas too. Then the second thing I studied was at Cambridge. I was in the first ever master's degree in sustainability leadership. So I have lots of green friends and a real network there. And I've been bringing both of those worlds together most of my career. So I was first in Shell. I then went into CO2 policy and then worked in technology. Innovation technology is really in the heart of what I've been doing through my career. And eventually translated that into leading and orchestrating Shell's net zero strategy. I left Shell a few years ago and took the opportunity to work for a national oil company in Abu Dhabi as the first ever group climate change officer there, working through the United Nations COP26 through to COP28, helping to set up a thing called the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter.
Which
I was
a
chair
few people
of,
may have heard of. So yeah, it's good.
yeah. So I immodestly take credit for coming up with ideas, but actually no credit at all for delivering on them, because it's really through a family of amazing friends and colleagues who helped me to do that. Not the least folks at the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative and hundreds of NOC chief sustainability officers. And there's a bit of a history there. I also set up a thing called the Industrial Transition Accelerator, which Mission Possible now does, with help from Bloomberg and Bezos and others as well. So once again, I came up with a couple of ideas, and then a few talented friends marked my homework and said, well, this is how we could do it. But throughout my career, I've been kind of trying to lead the way on sustainability. And I guess we'll get to talk about a few of those things today. I'm also a visiting professor helping the Sustainable Futures Lab at Imperial College here in London.
Very cool. There is, like you said, there is so much for us to unpack. I love it. And so, yeah, super glad that we finally got our schedules to align so that we could make this work. So, like, given the background in oil and gas and also the work that you've been doing around decarbonization in the space and stuff like that, like, I want to start with the conversation around investment. There's been a lot of pushback, I would say, particularly from the climate folks around investing in fossil fuels. We're seeing a very big shift here in the US where it's all fossil fuels and nothing else. Like, I'm really curious for you. Like, what do you say in terms of the investment landscape between, oil and gas and renewables and other decarbonization kind of like innovations and some of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so the first thing to say is that if you go to places I'm very familiar with, uh, like Texas, Texas has got one of the fastest growing electricity power sectors in the world. And that's the home of oil and gas, Houston, global capital for some. So um, it, it it's not really as polar as people imagine. I still think there's continued growth in renewables. The reason oil and gas continues to attract capital is due to the need for energy security, and you just don't transform your entire energy system overnight. Um, and it has got strong returns as well, which a lot of people depend on, and not the least some of the energy companies that want to invest in renewables and invest in infrastructure. Changing those things around takes trillions of dollars worth of capital investment. So, and at the same time, what I often explain to people is the energy transition, you shouldn't expect it to be linear. And when people think about emissions just going down and down and down in a beautiful straight line in every single place in every single part of the world, well, I grew up in Singapore as a kid. I also originally was born and come from a little island off the west coast of Scotland, a farming community. You wouldn't exactly expect energy transition to happen in both those places in exactly the same way. Although back in my home island of Tiree, we do have a wind turbine, a community turbine that's made money that pays for the kindergarten and things there.
That's cool.
So it won't happen at the same pace in every place. It'll be different paces in different places. So it's a non-linear energy transition. We're seeing that geopolitically, and we'll get more into that around the world. But the oil and gas firms distributed something 200 billion in dividends in 2024, 130 billion in buybacks globally in the same year, and capital expenditure going from a real low point during COVID it rose over 50% over the last 4 years because people still need cheap, affordable, available energy. 75% of investors still engage in fossil fuel projects, especially natural gas, which is kind of bridging fuel. There's a lot lower emissions than oil. And that's because of energy security, and all your industry and your businesses depend upon these kind of access to energy questions, depending at which stage you are in terms of your economic development. So it's important also to recognize that here in the UK, for example, it takes time to change. Renewables has, I think it's like over 700 gigawatts of grid connection delays with wait times up to 15 years. We designed our energy system to be hugely centralized with big power stations. We didn't design it to everybody to have solar and hundreds of wind turbines to be connected. It just takes time to do that, and people at National Grid and folks here are working flat out to try and fix that. So I think it will take off over time. Climate tech funding.
Just jumping in there. I mean, I was absolutely. We see the same kind of permitting issues here in North America, but I had no idea that you guys were seeing the same sort of thing in the UK and other in other parts of the world. Like, it's a huge challenge when people are talking about like how do we bring on all forms of energy and stuff like that when there's these huge challenges across all this, oil and gas has challenges, but the fact that there's all these challenges as well, that's a huge delay. So yeah, it's significant.
Yeah, but I mean, I see some places. Australia has a very digital grid, so it's easy to see how you can connect. I have friends who have a big battery energy storage system company who are moving incredibly fast there. So once again, there's some places where you can move really quickly. They're more set up for this than others. And we'll come back to this, but you see exponential growth in some areas. Electric vehicles in China since 2020 has really been off the scale. And we're starting to see that around the world. But there's pockets of incredible acceleration. And then there's big, heavy infrastructure stuff like running power lines and transmission lines that just takes time.
Yeah. So, like, in terms of then the challenges around like getting stuff, the grid constraint stuff, like, does that flow into policy constraints and stuff in the UK as well, or funding constraints? If people are like, well, we can't even get stuff turned on, so like, why should we fund it and things like that? Like, are you seeing challenges in terms of money flowing in then?
Well, yes. I mean, if you have a limit to how fast you can get your grid connection, it's going to take you over a decade.
Mm.
Then that's that much longer before you see any returns on that investment.
Yeah.
So you have to be selective about where the right policy and regulatory environment is, but also where there's a physical connection. A really simple way of thinking about that: if you connect into an existing, let's say, transformer, or where there was a power station before, you can bolt on other connections onto the side of things. But if you can't do that, then it takes you multiple years to get yourself on a queue for Siemens or GE to buy a new transformer so you can connect in. So finding where there already were connections are kind of sweet spots in the system. But over time, this will become normal and it'll be easy
Yeah.
to connect up. But just at the outset, and we're really still at the outset of transforming an electricity system, there's a lot more to energy than just electricity.
Yeah.
But electricity in the next 5 to 10 years is going to be where a lot of power will be able to transform in particular.
So, I completely agree. I mean, one of the challenges, and I've heard this a lot before, is around, like, you talked about the returns earlier, right? Like, understanding returns from renewable projects are a little bit lower, but usually pretty reliable, versus returns from oil and gas, right? Like, they fluctuate with the market and oil price and all this kind of stuff, and so it starts to create a different landscape, and that I kind of wanted to then build on, like, you talked about at the top, you sit in both worlds. Like, you sit in the renewable technology world, you sit in the oil and gas space. How do you see the language around investment changing? Or do you see the language around investment changing, with how people are framing opportunities, talking about opportunities? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of the conversation has been dominated by people having a conversation about what the end game should be rather than getting started. And I do find that there's a lot of, whichever perspective you come from, there's a lot of arguing rather than acting. A classic example is carbon capture and storage, where I was sitting with some colleagues in the government here, where they were having conversations about whether there was enough storage capacity under the North Sea to do all the carbon capture and storage they might want to do. I don't think that's the debate you should be having. I think you should be, can we try the first 3 or 4, sure that it works, that it's safe, that you get public acceptance, that you can decarbonize some people's jobs. Yeah, that there's some existing industries out there that is really difficult to change into another industry without using carbon capture technology. What I mean by change to another industry, a clean version of an existing industry. So I find folks having these conversations about what we'll do in 20 or 30 years when I'm really focused on what we're going to do in the next 5.
Yeah.
Can we demonstrate these things? Do they work? Can we make sure that all the options we have are open? And then we learn and find out which is the right balance and mix, because it will be a mosaic of different opportunities.
Yeah.
What I see is the language at the moment, going back to your point, I wrote something on LinkedIn recently about how that language is shaping and changing. I think it's, I think John Kerry, Secretary Kerry was talking about this recently. The ESG, environment, social governance, the ESG that everyone talks about, if that was about efficiency, security, and growth as ESG, that would be very powerful to a lot of investors nowadays.
Yeah.
And I find finding language which translates into action rather than argument and translates into partnerships for prosperity is really how you get to sustainability. And that version of ESG, efficiency, you're saving energy, you're saving water. It's not necessarily only sustainability about climate, for example. There's lots of good examples of that. And I see this also really developing with AI accelerating innovation in energy. And energy transition, as I said, is reshaping the workforce, not just creating hybrid roles across clean energy, so offshore technology and things that we kind of worked in oil and gas, helps you understand to do offshore wind turbines, but also that you can have clean oil and gas too. So you can do a gas-fired power plant with carbon capture and storage, which uses gas but has 95% less emissions, let's say. But more importantly, there's lots of jobs around the world where people depend on oil and gas energy, where if we can decarbonize through carbon capture storage or other technologies, we decarbonize the jobs. It's not all about the new jobs adding, it's also about creating new clean jobs. And you can do that with oil and gas people as well.
Yeah. I talk to students quite a lot as well. And again, like we've got to solve all these problems, right? We still need students going into oil and gas to understand, like to your point, like if we don't have people that understand how oil and gas works and like the skill sets that come with that, then it's going to be really challenging to decarbonize the space in and of itself. So I like your framing around that of like decarbonizing jobs as well. It's not just about decarbonizing the actual physical assets and stuff. So like moving beyond kind of like the financial piece, like, and I like how you're framing the language, and the CCS example is a great one as well in terms of like, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? Like it's like, how do we get started on this? You've talked about value and like how do we reframe these things? And these things being investments and projects and decarbonization projects and stuff like that. Like what is that broadly, like what other kind of areas are you looking at and what does that mean to you, essentially, in terms of value creation?
So it's a once in a generation opportunity, which is really exciting. So the students you were talking about, Deb, if I was a student at the beginning of my career, I never thought that I would just be an engineer. I'm a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering. I never felt myself as an engineer. I wasn't particularly into maths, but I was a creative problem solver, and there isn't a bigger problem in the world to solve today. Yeah, this is really transformational. And to be an energy engineer, or to be in any industry where you've got to decarbonization, become a decarbonization engineer. Much of the skills I have are applicable across multiple industries. I'm often helping people in many different clean tech ventures and different ideas and technologies. So if think of yourself as an energy engineer or a decarbonization engineer or just an engineer who is a creative problem solver, that's a great start.
Yeah.
So where do I see opportunities? So smart grids and EV infrastructure are creating hybrid roles which combine both software and hardware expertise. As I said, my family company was advanced electronics and downhole electronics and all this kind of stuff, but that was hardware and software. And I think whether that's robotics or data science, learn to do Python. As I was saying, smart grids and EV infrastructure are creating hybrid roles combining software and hardware expertise. So I think that's really exciting. My friend Gemma runs a company called Power Ledger, which brought blockchain and software expertise into helping villages and communities manage their own distributed energy. And she started that in 2016.
That's cool.
And now it's growing all over the world. AI-enabled climate tech startups attracted over 1.3 billion a year before last, and that was double compared to 2022. I've just been last couple of days at Climate Investments. I was the founding chair of a thing called Climate Investments, actually sponsored by oil and gas companies. It's over $1 billion fund. And I was there learning about how far we've come with digital twins. This is virtual reality copies of refineries and power plants. And then you use robotics and unmanned vehicles, whether that's drones or subsea, to go and monitor these things. What does that do? That gives you predictive maintenance, which leads to 10 to 20% energy savings in industrial settings. It's also other things in sustainability, important in places like California and the Middle East, because you can get AI-based irrigation systems that achieve 50% water savings. So I think AI is going to help us have, earlier I was talking about smart grids and infrastructure.
Yeah.
You're going to need less of that if you can do it more efficiently. That's why I talk about ESG, the number one being efficiency.
Yep.
So we might not need to build all the transmission lines and all the new infrastructure if we can use AI and smart technologies to really make a difference. So I think that would be one area I'm excited about. And if I was going to choose just the other one, at the moment we've got two different electricity systems. We have the renewable system and then a fossil fuel system and some nuclear as well. But what that means is that we're paying for multiples redundant systems because we don't have a backup for the renewables without retaining our existing fossil fuel system. So the holy grail for this is to have battery solutions. And at the moment, the kind of batteries that we have in our phones or in our cars aren't enough. And we really need some breakthroughs there. So I'm most excited about being able to do energy storage
Oh,
in ways that mean that we will have less need for redundant duplicate energy systems as well, because that's going to bring the cost down
mm,
of our energy. Here in the UK, the cost of electricity is multiple times more expensive than it is compared to the US. You may have heard that.
yeah.
And that's because we have a lot of redundant duplication. We pay people when their wind turbines are collecting more energy than the grid can handle, because it's not necessarily in the right place where that energy is being generated. We pay people not to turn on their wind turbines. That just makes no sense at all. Yeah. So you have lots of things within our energy system that have grown just because we're going through this learning and developing stage. But eventually we'll be able to make our systems much more efficient and cheap, because it's more economically efficient as well.
Yeah. No, that, like you said, when we're getting to the point where where we're not, because this is always the criticism of some of the renewables, right? Is the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. And if when the wind is actually blowing, we're not collecting that energy, then yeah, like we're doubly kicking ourselves in the foot a little bit. I'm curious, like as you're going out and working with these institutes and investing groups and some of that kind of stuff, how much of your role is as a translator between clean tech and industry and some of that kind of stuff? I find myself in this, it's been a really interesting kind of evolution where, because I can sort of speak both languages. So I'm just kind of curious to your experience in that sort of role. And if you've
Yeah.
had a
So
similar one.
well, we were having a chat about this at the
Yeah.
start, Deb. So I mentioned, so I've a master's degree in petroleum engineering. I have a master's degree in sustainability leadership. The third thing I did was a master's degree in coaching and behavioral change. And that language and the science of being human is really important in this space. Um, so a lot of the time is about making sure that we tailor our solutions in ways that illustrate benefits to whoever is our stakeholder.
Mm,
And I do find that if we can learn to speak in language that your mom and dad or your brothers and sisters or people who are not in this space can really understand, and then figure out why that's something that's important to them or makes a difference. But, just think about if you talk about what a difference it makes for your kids, for example. I think there's ways to connect to people on that basis all the time.
mm,
And I do also think that simplifying, carbon capture and storage, well, what does that actually mean?
yeah.
Or energy transition. If I asked 5 different people working in this space what energy transition means, who are experts, I wouldn't come out with the same answer. And I've tried to do these things with multiple companies before. So just getting alignment in what we actually mean and what's in it for you,
Yeah.
depending on your background, I think is absolutely essential. So your point about the language is critical, but not because it's to try and spin it. It's not about marketing. It's about making sure that we equip people. You were talking about the students you talked to, Deb. I think that students don't need to go and learn from a teacher nowadays. They'll be on Google or AI and watching influencers. They can make their own decisions. But what I want to do is make sure that people are equipped with all the right evidence, the full perspective, not just one particular perspective, so that they can make a balanced judgment based on all the information that's out there. So I always did this when I was framing net zero targets for Shell, for example. We started off using Shell's fantastic scenarios, but I thought it's just never going to be credible because they're made by Shell. So people are just never going to trust those, even though it's brilliant work and I recommend them to everyone.
Yeah.
Because I have firsthand experience of that. But using the International Panel on Climate Change scenarios, showing the full range of those and showing where our targets sit within those gave it a lot more
Yeah.
credibility. So choosing partners that are trusted. I work a lot with NGOs, for example. It helped. I studied in those kind of spaces, so I could bridge some of those different communities together. And investors group, the institutional investors group on climate change, I spent a lot of time talking to them and came up with the first joint declaration on how we should do climate change goals with Shell and the institutional investors group on climate change. So doing it, collaboration is really the key here. So the language is about helping people to collaborate.
Yeah. No, I love that. So a couple more things that I want to dive into, because I know like you've been very focused on things like policy and um, stuff like that. Like emissions, I think, in terms of framing and language, like for a lot of companies, potentially is a liability. So like what does that mean to you? And like, how do you think about that in the broader context of both companies and also policy? Like, curious.
Yeah, that's another thing that a lot of folks who don't work in the kind of spaces we are working in don't engage with policymakers. So this is about government setting up regulations and directions. You can get industry bodies who do policies as well, for example, but let's just talk about the kind of policies where you're mentioning about emissions becoming, say, a financial liability or at least a risk. Back in I think it was 2012, I went on expedition to Antarctica. It was like 80 people from about 30 countries. And I was there to share some of that knowledge I was talking about on what's happening with climate change and energy transition. There's no doubt in my mind and overwhelming scientific evidence that we are changing our physical environment. There is climate change, which is connected to humanity. There may be some other reasons as well, but the big changes we've seen through the industrialization over the last couple hundred years is certainly something that contributes to a greater frequency of extreme weather events. So that's why if you're an insurance company, you will see tangibly that there's been a change in how much it costs you to look after your house insurance in places where you get a lot of wildfires in Canada, for example, British Columbia, etc. So there's tangible reasons for this. This has led to investor pressure and regulatory momentum. And if we talk about Europe, where I'm based, there's the EU emission trading scheme that's been going on for many years, more than 20 years. And now there's a thing called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is a way to make sure that your imports are not bringing in carbon, because you might stop using carbon-intensive ways to manufacture goods in your region, but then import them from somewhere else where they're bad actors. So the Carbon Border Adjustment is coming in now, and that will force emissions reporting on imports like steel, cement, and aluminium. Last month, I was advising an African national mining company how to set up a carbon markets desk precisely because of this.
Wow.
And what does that mean in terms of liabilities? Well, EU imports of fertilizers could reduce by a quarter, aluminium by about 5%. It's millions and millions and millions of dollars. And from 2026, at the moment it's in the kind of trial phase, it gets real then. Importers must import carbon border adjustment management certificates. And that's going to expand again in 2027. Later this decade to increase compliance complexity. So even road transport fuels are going to be included in this. So you've got to pay for your carbon. Yeah. So what's fascinating about this is not, and this is what people miss, this is not a way to just tax people for carbon intensive goods that are coming into the European Union. This is a way to make sure that other parts of the world who want to export to the EU reduce the emissions in making the goods themselves, because you don't want to pay the EU for the carbon in your goods. What you can do is tax your own goods, and then the EU won't tax you.
Yeah.
So remove the emissions and show that you're doing that. So this is actually a way to export carbon pricing to other parts of the world, and people don't recognize that. So you will see that if you're a Japanese exporter, that the Japanese company will want to use low carbon steel, because that government can keep the money that it would have to pay to the EU, instead invest that in Japan, but do that by making their steel low carbon, for example.
Yeah.
So I think that this emissions import-export tax is actually a way to export the carbon pricing you already see in the EU emissions trading scheme, which is scaling and scaling and scaling to many parts of society. It's absolutely critical, because without a carbon price, there isn't really a business case for doing these things. And therefore, increased wildfires or other climate change issues, where do you get the money to pay for these things? Well, this is one way of doing that. And those who have cleaner technologies will benefit and have a leadership position.
Yeah. Well, and the pricing piece of it goes to the liability as well, right? Like it's not just the liability in terms of emission destruction because of fires and hurricanes and whatever else, but yeah, then if there's a price to be paid, that's another risk for companies in terms of, well, and it also gives a lever in my mind to, well, how much could a company invest versus then the price difference and some of that kind of stuff. So companies can then start making financial decisions around their operations and their products and stuff like that. Maybe it's cheaper to just pay the penalty and not spend the capital. In some cases, it'll be cheaper to spend the capital and not pay the penalty. So it's like, I think it's a mechanism there that allows for decisions as well. So
Yeah, but this is normal business choices. So first of all, I don't think you have to do everything today. It's worth investing collectively across a number of companies to take small bets and learn about things and advance those technologies. It doesn't have to be done overnight. You don't need to bet the company on it, but this is normal prudence for managing what might happen in future. You look at your different scenarios depending where you are in the world. Yeah, where might the carbon price be higher? Where might they be lower? And think through your risk approach. But I'd flip it on the other way and say, what's the opportunity here as well? So when I was first doing policy, CO2 policy for Shell, EU emissions trading scheme, the certificates you use there, those were single figure euros per ton. And they went to double and even triple now. So if I bought a whole bunch of them and held on to them, there was arbitrage possibilities, there still are, and all these things, trading opportunities. And as the integrity and the quality of carbon credits, for example, are getting better, I think there's huge opportunities on the horizon. And I think that in all the different technologies as well. Much more efficient, secure energy technologies are going to be valuable.
yeah.
And so how can you get in there and learn about those? Gosh, I mean, if you'd had a chance to invest in Meta or Palantir or NVIDIA, and you did have a chance to invest in NVIDIA 25 years ago and Meta maybe 20 years ago, wouldn't you be sitting pretty now?
Yep.
So, I do think within all of those spaces, energy technology is one of them that's also got a great opportunity for the entrepreneurs who are listening out there today as well. And there's plenty of you out there. You're not alone.
Yeah.
Ready to supply all the clean energy we're going to need for AI and all those kind of different sister and brother technologies that are coming in the next few years.
No, and it's a great example, to be honest. Like it's the secondary market in the EU emissions trading scheme that allows people to, when I teach at one of the universities here in Colorado, and for the students, I'm like, this is, at the end of the day, this is a market. Like people are buying and selling and trading allowances and credits and doing well, like in a lot of situations on some of this. And I think your point around all the technology that's now needed for all of those big tech companies is exactly, it's a huge opportunity because, we've talked about it a lot. It's the energy system is completely changing. And so there's a lot of solutions that are going to be needed for that. So the final thing I wanted to chat about, like you're obviously sitting in the UK, and there's a lot going on between like the EU and the UK versus the US and stuff like that. I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts around like, what do you see from your perspective on your side of the pond, as they would call it, around the differences in what's kind of going on nationally and internationally right now?
That's a really great the global perspective, because funnily enough, I spent most of my career living overseas and actually outside Europe. I spent as much time in the US or Far East as I've done here at home. So the EU continues to lead with aggressive policy frameworks. That's the nature of the EU, while the US is more market driven. I've always liked that, the market driven approach. And as I said, the transition is nonlinear, with exponential trends emerging in unexpected regions, some expected, like China. some unexpected. Africa using mobile telephony to do banking was an example of how these things, you can leapfrog what we're trying to do. Solar is a great example in Africa and India. And people talk about electric vehicles, they think about BYD or Tesla. Well, they should think about three-wheel and mopeds in India being electric on a scale you couldn't believe, right?
Yeah.
And Indonesia and these places. But so the EU mandates a 55% emissions cut by 2030, full neutrality by 2050. And at the same time, the US has once again withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. Now, I'm far more relaxed about that than some people, because as I said, it's non-linear. And I worked in companies like Shell that thinks over decades, things will move forwards and backwards. And actually, by having different models on how these things evolve, you can actually learn from all of them. And who's to say which approach isn't the right approach? The EU retains there's various different sustainability reporting and the CBAM I talked about, as well as methane emissions reduction policies, etc., which work for some of the American companies I know who have got terrific technologies for reducing methane in wellheads, for example. Yeah. The US had defunded parts of the Inflation Reduction Act. Well, if you are the Europeans, you're really happy to hear that because of the market-driven Inflation Reduction Act, the US was sucking up all of the talent and all of the technology leadership. So you're actually, US is giving others a chance to catch up. But once again, as I said, there's China, Asia, there's all sorts of different players. So in a way that we're seeing a bit of a balancing out with in the language, in the policy, in the approaches. In the West and in Asia, it was already racing ahead because of Chinese leadership. AI-driven energy systems forecast 30 to 50% fewer outages in smart grids. Renewables are still projected to be the majority of global electricity by 2030. And global emissions are still projected to drop by over 60% by 2050 already, although warming is still projected at 2.2 degrees C by 2100. And let me just say, the Paris Agreement said 2 degrees C by 2100. And we've got down to 2.2 by 2100. So we're actually just a hair's breadth away from reaching the high end of what people wanted to achieve with the Paris Agreement. So I just want to give hope to everyone that even though we might have different approaches and different paces in different places, overall, we're not that far off the Paris Agreement. Yeah. And I've got great belief that we will be able to do a lot more in the coming decades because we're only going to get better and faster at many of the different technologies that are already with us today.
Yeah. No, I love that. I love that hopeful kind of outlook on that. So like your final thoughts and stuff. You're at Highland Sustainability. Like talk about that and like any final takeaways for everyone as well as we wrap up.
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn or Highland.earth.
Cool. And we
the final thing
we'll link those in the notes for folks as well.
Yeah, thanks. The final thing is I always show that I was showing you this thing earlier, this book, The Wizard and the Prophet.
I love
that. So for people like us that are collaborators, and we see this as the once in a generation opportunity is, The Wizard and the Prophet, the wizard is a guy called Norman Borlaug, who's the legendary plant breeder who won the 1970 Nobel Peace Prize. So we do this in the week that the Peace Prize has been awarded. And Norman in the 60s used new agricultural technology to raise grain harvests, so averted millions of deaths. And in fact, the 7 or 8, 9 billion people on the planet today, 3 billion people wouldn't be alive today without the fertilizers and agricultural technologies that were brought in that green revolution. I see myself, I've done a lot of technology. I was involved in leading technology research and things in Shell, a lot of venturing. So I'm a believer in techno-optimism, that we will come up with ways to solve a lot of these problems. On the other side, the prophet, that was the wizard. Now the prophet is an ecologist called William Vogt. He spent years going around South America to assemble what became the basic ideas behind the global environmental movement. I said I'm an engineer. I am an engineer. I'm not an environmentalist. But he helped us to see the immutable natural boundaries, our biological limits. Johan Rockstrom of Stockholm Resilience Institute translate these into planetary boundaries. There's 9 of those. And of the 9, 7 are transgressed. But just let me say this, although that sounds really dreadful and negative, the optimism in me tells me that of the 9, the ozone depletion was reversed. That was one that was transgressed, and we were able to get back within that planetary boundary. I also think we can kind of expand, contract, and help with our techno-optimism on moving some of those planetary boundaries as well. But my role, and I think one of the reasons we've been good friends over the years, Deb, is because we can show you can do both, to create prosperity for humanity and to live within those natural limits in harmony. And it's not easy to do. It takes a lot of creativity. It takes us working together, but we can do it. So the wizard and the prophet is not the wizard or the prophet. And I think that's the important message for me today.
Oh, I absolutely love that. John, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. And hello to everyone. Thanks for joining.